Welcome to Calgary in Depth. This is your host, Dan Kostka. Today I'm joined with Patricia Salo here in her home, actually in southwest Calgary. So thank you for welcoming me into your home.
You're most welcome.
This is the first time I've interviewed a guest in their own home. Now I understand that, like myself, you were born in Ontario. Please tell us when your Calgary story began.
I moved to Calgary in 1974. I had been living in Montreal at that time. Although I was born in Ontario, I lived in Montreal from 1970 to 74, and then I moved here when my husband came out to work for one of the local stockbroker firms. It was cold. It was the end of November. He had come out ahead to find a place for us to live, and I and my two children packed up our apartment in Montreal and tootled our way out here. Calgary was a surprise.
Yeah, please expand on that. So you're used to Montreal. Now Calgary also gets cold like Montreal does, but what were some of the differences that stood out most to you when you first saw Calgary compared to your previous home of Montreal?
Well, Calgary didn't have a lot of snow compared to Montreal. Montreal gets tons of snow some winters, but I had come from I'd been working at the Royal Victoria Hospital. I worked for the head of medicine there. Very busy career, exciting, interesting, lots of people. My children were cared for by a lady who came into our apartment and looked after them. Came to a complete halt. Screech! I arrive in Calgary. I'm now living in Glamorgan. We have one car, which my husband would drive downtown when he was going to work. So I was at home with two children, 2 and 4, or 1.5 and 3.5, about that. Nobody adult to talk to. Felt very isolated. The transit system was not good. And to bundle my kids up and get them on a bus to go somewhere, I didn't know Calgary at all. I just found it was a very isolating experience. And so my poor husband, when he would get home at night, I would go blah, 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 because I was so excited to have an adult to talk to. Fortunately, one of my neighbors, I met her, and she got me involved in a Beta Sigma Phi sorority, which is not a university-related sorority. It's just a women's group. I joined that, even though I'm not a joiner, because, again, I was making some connections. And that was the beginning of me getting to know Calgary. Now, having said that, Calgary was dark, it felt to me, and cold and lonely. But New Year's Day, so, a month after I'd moved here, we were driving out towards Bragg Creek, and it was 60 degrees. Everything was Fahrenheit in those days, and I'm still in a Fahrenheit world in my head. And things were melting. The sun was shining. It was beautiful. And I thought, oh, my word. This is not Montreal. This is for sure. And I was, my heart lifted, and I thought, yes, I can do this. I can do this. And phoned my family long distance and said, it's melting out here. It's 60 degrees. I can't believe it. And they were all shocked to know that, because they knew nothing about Calgary. People who live in Ontario don't know much about Calgary.
Right. And I'm curious, though, before you came here, when you told people in Montreal that you were planning to go to Calgary, what kind of reaction did you get? Did you get a sense of what their image of Calgary and Alberta was?
The prior impression that I had came from one of the physicians that I worked with. I did some extra typing for him. He had come to Calgary when he first moved to Canada. He was one of the Middle European countries, and he came on a train, got off the train down at the train station, and it was almost horse and buggy stage. At least that's the way he told me the story. And so my picture, even though I knew Calgary was modern since then, but my picture was, it was a very small and rural, not a sophisticated community, whereas Montreal was sophisticated. That was my first early knowledge about Calgary. Of course, I knew about the Stampede, but that's about it. Really, oil and gas, we knew about that. Stampede, end of story.
And were you fluent in French at the time?
No, I never learned French. I had studied it in high school, of course, But working at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, that's an inner city hospital, and the main second language spoken there was Portuguese, oddly enough. It was also before the Quiet Revolution, and so if you spoke English, that's all you had to speak when you were in Montreal. French-speaking people had to speak English, and that was sort of the accepted. And of course that changed after I left, and on subsequent visits when I would go back, because I loved Montreal. It was very strange to not be able to speak the language, and of course I hadn't had to before, but to not speak the language that people wanted me to address them in.
I see. Because I thought if you were fluent in French, then people might be thinking, well, you're never going to use your French again if you're moving to Alberta.
Yeah, no, I have a poor ear for languages, so I've always struggled to try and to do anything with languages. I studied Latin, of course, and Spanish when I was in high school, and don't speak any of those languages to me because I'll look at you blankly.
Yeah, I admire anyone who can speak a second language or third or fourth, because I've been visiting Slovakia since I was a child, when it was still Czechoslovakia, and I'm still not fluent in it. So I admire anyone who can, pick up another language, because it is a talent that not all of us have, obviously.
Right. I'm just happy when people can speak good English.
Yes.
And I'm not talking about people whose first language is not English. I'm talking about people who grew up speaking English and yet have difficulty using interesting words or using words other than like.
Yes.
That drives me crazy.
Yes, and using proper grammar,
Yeah.
Yes, that seems to be an art that's going away, unfortunately, or a skill that's going away. So when you think back to when you first came to Calgary, what are some of the first experiences that stand out in your mind? And when did you start to feel like it was home?
Oh, wow. I had my third and last child the December after I arrived here. So I have to say, when I was pregnant at any time, the world went by me without me taking much notice. And then when the children were born, I was so immersed in what was happening to them that I wasn't really conscious of that much about my surroundings, because my focus was on them. So there are people who say they remember what they were doing, say, when Kennedy was shot, or different major news events. And most of the time I don't have a clue what I was doing because my head was in a different space. As my children got a bit older, we went to, of course, the Stampede every year. We would go to the evening performance. Of course, the kids wanted to go to on the rides and things like that. So I always did that.
When you say the evening performance, you mean the grandstand show?
Right,
yes.
Right, yes. Yeah, so we'd see the chuck wagon races, and then we'd see all the entertainment. And I remember being there on a number of occasions wearing ski jackets because it was so cold, and looking at the young people who were doing the synchronized swimming and thinking, oh my word, how on earth can they possibly stand to... They might be okay when they're in the water because it wouldn't be quite so cold, but when they're standing outside with wet swimsuits on, I thought, that's awful. That's awful.
Are you saying as part of the grandstand show, they had swimming?
They had synchronized swimming, yes.
Really?
Oh,
because I've been 2 or 3 times to the grandstand show, but never saw some swimming.
Oh, well, wow. You missed out then. That must have been a long time ago. When my kids got old enough, they were only interested in going to the Midway and seeing some of the sights, and they weren't interested in the grandstand show, so I stopped going with them. And I'm not one for crowds, so if I could give it a miss, I was quite happy. I enjoy the Stampede, all the stuff. I never go to the breakfast, though, because I'm not fond of flapjacks.
I see. Yeah, there are a lot of free flapjacks given away every year. So if you're not a fan of them, then... Yeah. How about places you and your family like to visit when your kids were growing up, like outside the city?
We went to the Montreal Museum, of course, and the zoo. Oh my, that was fantastic. Heritage Park, a couple of times, but it wasn't so much on my list until I moved into the area I'm in now. But yeah, the zoo was a favorite for the kids and I.
And for road trips outside the city?
Oh, well, because my family all lived in Ontario, in order for my parents to see the children, or to visit with my sister, I flew there rather than making so many road trips here. I tended to go there for vacations simply because I did want, of course, to stay in touch with my parents and my sisters. Yeah.
And how did being here in Alberta shape your view of Ontario when you saw Ontario again? Like, what struck you when you'd go back there about the differences?
It's funny you should say that. So two things jump into my mind. One of them is when you look at a map and you look at the map and you're thinking, how long is it going to take me to drive from here to here? And when you look at a map of Alberta and you look at an inch, it's going to take you at least an hour to drive that inch on the map. You look at this map of Ontario and you look at an inch, that's going to take you 20 minutes. Because I'm sure the scale has something to do with that, but that's what comes into my mind when I think about taking a road trip. The other thing is Alberta's spaces. We have this huge sky. It goes on forever. When you're on the prairies or Calgary, being on the cusp as we are, you look out and it's enormous. But when you're in Ontario, you never get that long perspective. It seems short. And in a way, I find that, this is my feeling, people seem to want to know your business much more. You know, the curtain, they ease the curtain aside to kind of peek out and see what you're doing. Whereas in Alberta, people leave you alone. Like, they respect your privacy much more. And I feel more relaxed and more open. I don't know if it's just this big sky, but really I feel that Calgary and Alberta is a very open place to live. Do you know, when I would drive into the mountains, I found it would freak me out because I felt claustrophobic. There were these mountains, huge things all around me. It spooked me. I finally learned to ski. I would have been about my mid-30s. And as soon as I learned to ski, I stopped feeling claustrophobic in the mountains. And that opened up another world to me. So it was a very strange thing. The other thing, talking about the big sky in Alberta, I discovered virga, the rain that falls down, and you can see it falling down, but it never hits the earth because I guess it evaporates on the way down through the atmosphere. So that was wonderful. Or the cloud formations, or you can watch a rainstorm come by, and you watch it and you watch it, and it just passes you. It never comes close, but you can watch it traverse the skyline. Whereas in Ontario, if it's raining, at least in the areas that I was in, if it was raining everywhere. There was you never saw a rain cloud passing through. It just rained on you, period.
When you mentioned feeling claustrophobic when you were skiing, something that reminds me of is one time I was in high school in Canmore, and I was working in the grocery store, and I had a tourist come in as a woman, middle-aged or maybe slightly older, and I assumed she was from the U.S., probably because most of the tourists seem to be from the U.S., and she asked me, "Don't you feel very closed in with the mountains around you?" And it had literally never occurred to me, having grown up in Canmore, it had never occurred to me that I'd feel closed in. I said to her, "They're not that close." I said, you'd have to, they're not that close. And I said, it kind of feels kind of protective, not claustrophobic, but it had never occurred to me before that the mountains would make me feel closed in. So I guess, obviously, that woman was not alone, that you felt that, and then obviously many other people must feel it at first, if they're not used to it.
Yeah. It's the opposite of feeling closed in the mountains is when I'm on the prairies, I feel insignificant. I am just this teeny-weeny little being with this huge sky and this huge flat land that stretches out forever in front of me. So it's a flip-flop to go from the prairies into the mountains, and they're diametrically opposed feelings. Yeah.
And earlier, when you mentioned that in Calgary, you kind of can live your own life, you are left alone. There's more of an independent spirit here, I think it's fair to say, where people don't mind your business as much as they might in some other places, like Ontario. But isn't there a flip side to, speaking of flip-flops, isn't there a flip side to that where you can also be very isolated if you don't make the effort to connect with other people? you can drive downtown or wherever your job is and then come back home and not know your neighbors and be disconnected from others if you don't make the effort to connect with people here?
Well, it depends on who you are to start with. If you are a person who connects, it doesn't matter whether you live in Calgary or Ontario. The feeling I and this is just a weird impression, is that the old ladies are watching me. Whereas in Calgary, the old ladies aren't watching me. I don't feel isolated. I mean, I felt isolated when I first moved here just because I knew nobody. But then when I lived in Montreal, I didn't know my neighbors. I only knew the people at my office where I went to work. I knew the concierge. He would call my son Jojo Joel. So no, I like being independent. And if I wanted to reach out, I was capable of doing that. Yeah.
And what are some ways over the years that you did connect with other people?
As I said, I belonged to Beta Sigma Phi for probably 5 or 6 years. I moved out of the city and lived on an acreage out near Millerville for 3 or 4 years. I was divorced at that time, and that was a difficult period. Then I moved back into town because my kids were growing old enough that I was concerned about them driving on Highway 22. At that time, it was just a 2-lane highway, and there were a number of accidents that had taken place, or people had car breakdowns and then they had evil things happen to them. I think there were a couple of murders or just tough stuff that made me feel a bit anxious. So my kids were going to be driving soon, and so I wanted back into the city where this would not be an issue. And I went to work. I worked at the University of Calgary for nigh on 20 years, worked for the Faculty of Medicine. Really enjoyed my work there. And I really felt I was contributing to the overall well-being of the world because the medical school, we trained doctors and we had researchers. It was really neat stuff that went on there. I was quite excited about that. I liked my job. I liked the people I worked with. It was very exciting. I spent long hours there, and then I burned out and took early retirement. But then I've retired a second time since then. So after that first retirement, I renovated the house that I'm living in right now, joined Curves, joined Weight Watchers, again, meeting people, lost 70 pounds. And then I thought, now I'm bored. So I went back to work, ended up working in the oil patch. And while I worked at the university, I always thought, the oil patch, ooh, evil. They do evil things and they make a lot of money. And then I went to work for them and thought, wow. The companies, any of the companies that I worked with, because I did temp work at first and then I was hired on permanently, they had very high standards for the way they did their work. Safety was so important. There were many, many things that opened my eyes about what a good environment it was. Yes, we worked really hard. Everybody worked really hard. And it was tough sometimes to do that. But the spirit was, we weren't training doctors, but we were doing good things anyway. And we were doing things that protected the environment. And I really enjoyed that. And then things went badly for the company I was working for, and it ended up being taken over. And I got to retire again because the department I was in was basically closed and we were all laid off. And because I was already over 65 at that point, I got to retire a second time. And now I'm just trying to figure out what I'll be doing that I can retire from for the third time.
Do you have some thoughts on, just in general, what's it like to be a senior citizen in Calgary?
Well, my impression is very good. There are a lot of services. I belong to the Kirby Center. It's called Unison. Very inexpensive. They have many things. I don't avail myself of all of them, but they're there if I want them. When my husband was ill, the healthcare system and the support system through Alberta Health, exceptional. Very, very good. Of course, it's not perfect, but man, they were there when I needed them, and they were there when my husband needed them. I'm so thankful about that. My sisters are both older than me, and they live in Ontario, and their interactions with the healthcare system there are not as positive. I have close friends in BC. Same thing. It's not very good there. So when I hear people complaining about our healthcare here, I think, wow, you need to know that we have it good, comparatively speaking.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know another activity you're involved with is public speaking through the Toastmasters organization. In fact, I saw you at a public speaking competition a couple of weeks ago where you delivered a very powerful speech that you've graciously agreed to record, and there's a link below so you can actually view Patricia's speech that she delivered at Toastmasters, because I wanted to help you find a wider audience for it. And it's such a powerful speech, such a timely one. Can you tell us a bit about what inspired you to write that speech, and what do you hope that the listeners get from it?
About probably in January, when I knew that the government in the U.S. was changing, and then the events began to unfold as the new president took office, and all the nonsense that started to flow from that. During that man's first term, the only way I could stand to listen to the news about him was to watch Bill Maher and John Oliver. That was how I got my news. Because if I watched the daily news, I just went crazy. Now, at this time, with the second term happening, I couldn't avoid the news. I couldn't filter it as much as I wanted to, and I became angry. I became so angry, and it hurt me. When you carry that kind of anger, you have to do something with it. And because I like to write speeches, and I enjoy working with Toastmasters, I guess I can say I like Toastmasters because I'm in it. I meet good people there. I have opportunities to give speeches. And I thought, okay, it was time for me to do a speech. This is what I'm going to talk about. The first probably 3 versions of the speech, I would not have revealed them in public because I was just talking about all the bad things. And I knew I could not give a speech that only discussed bad things. I had to think about, what can I do? And so I wrote the speech. That's what I can do. And that's the point of my speech, is that each of us can find something that we can do. So I wrote the speech, I delivered it, my club really liked it, and they sent me on, and then I competed at another level. I put aside the anger, but I allowed it to form my thoughts around what needs to be done. The quote in my speech is that the only thing necessary for evil is for good men to do nothing, and I will not be someone who does nothing. That's why I wrote that speech. And I feel so strongly about it.
Well, it was that passion for the subject that really struck me when you delivered that speech that I attended. And that's why I'm so glad that you agreed to record a version of it, an identical version, exactly what you delivered before. You delivered it in a video that we can now share with others, because I'd love it for it to find as wide an audience as possible, because it is a disturbing time where it seems that all the norms of decency and don't bully others and don't name call, all the things we teach our kids are being ignored, and it's not acceptable. I mean, that's really what came across, that you were fed up, and that we have to all say that this is not acceptable, this is not normal.
That's right. That's right. Also, our country is under threat in ridiculous ways, just terrible ways. The only way as a country we're going to survive well is if we come together and act together. And that takes thought and calmness, but it takes some action as well. Not some of this terrible vandalism and stuff like that that I hear about. To me, that's the wrong way to go about things. But there are a number of other ways, and people are very creative. This was my creation, to write that speech and then deliver it, and then deliver it, and then deliver it. But other people will have their own thoughts. I talk to my neighbors. A friend of mine, she and I go walking together. I talk to my son. He and I walk our dogs together quite often. And we are always thinking about, what can we do, how can we do this, and where can we do it.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, Patricia. It's wonderful to speak with you. We've gone into Calgary's past, at least back to the 1970s. And we've gone all the way to the present with this very timely issue that we're all facing, where our country's being disrespected and our country's maybe identity and independence is being threatened, at least verbally. and hopefully it'll never go beyond that. Thank you so much again for spending some time with me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks, Dan.